The snow came without warning, a silent avalanche that devoured the forest in a single breath. Edward said, "The storm is hunting us." His words cracked like branches breaking under ice. The wind howled, a predator with teeth of frost, tearing warmth from the air. A fox cub whimpered, pressed tight to its mother's side, their fur already crusted white. Trees bent low, their spines snapping beneath heavy snow. A shadow moved at the tree line, a wolf shape circling, relentless and unseen yet felt. Nature had no mercy, only law, and that law demanded death for the weak. The storm roared louder, drowning out breath, erasing tracks before they could form. Margaret whispered, "It will bury us alive." The silence that followed was heavier than the storm itself, a silence filled with the certainty of danger closing in. The storm clawed deeper into the forest, swallowing the world whole. Edward said, "We cannot stay here." His breath vanished in the freezing air. Margaret's eyes darted to the fox mother huddled with her cub, fragile sparks of life in endless white. The wind shrieked, shaking branches like bones in a graveyard. Snowflakes, sharp as glass, lashed their faces raw. Edward stumbled, sinking to his knees, strength bleeding into cold ground. Margaret whispered, "The snow wants us gone." Every step they took was erased instantly, devoured by the storm's hunger. The forest itself seemed alive, each tree bending, each shadow watching. The fox cub whimpered again, piercing the roar. Edward said, "If we stop, we die." Death was no longer ahead. It circled them, unseen, closer with every breath. The storm thickened, erasing sky and ground into a single white void. Edward's voice cracked, "Keep moving." Margaret's legs trembled, her body bent with weight of ice. The fox mother growled faintly, curling tighter around her cub. A branch snapped behind them, echoing like thunder. The wolf's silhouette loomed again, closer this time, patient, circling like a phantom. Margaret said, "It follows us." Edward clenched his fists, defiance burning through frostbite. The storm was not chaos. It was a predator, deliberate, merciless. Snow piled higher, swallowing the trail. Margaret stumbled, collapsing into snow, gasping. Edward hauled her up, his lips blue, his eyes fierce. "Not here. Not now," he said. Behind them, glowing eyes burned brighter through the storm's veil. The storm screamed louder, 1,000 blades of ice tearing across the clearing. Edward shouted, "It wants us broken." Margaret clutched his coat, eyes wide with terror. The fox cub whimpered, its tiny body trembling beneath its mother's tail. The wolf circled, its steps muffled by snow, patient, waiting for weakness. Trees groaned and split in the distance, collapsing under frozen weight. Margaret whispered, "We are prey." Edward's chest heaved, each breath a cloud of frost. The storm stole warmth, stole strength, stole hope itself. Each gust shoved them closer to collapse. The fox mother growled, fur bristled, her gaze locked on the shadow. Edward said, "Then we fight." The wind drowned his voice instantly, but the defiance burned through his eyes. The storm slammed down like a hammer, crushing earth and bone beneath its weight. Edward stumbled, nearly collapsing, his strength bleeding away. Margaret cried, "It will bury us alive." Her voice cracked into the gale. The fox cub squealed, muffled under its mother's trembling body. The wolf paused, eyes glowing brighter, closer than before, a shadow fixed within the storm. Edward spat blood into the snow, his jaw clenched in fury. He said, "We do not die here." The wind howled, furious, smothering every sound of resistance. Trees groaned and collapsed around them, shaking the ground. Margaret's tears froze instantly, her voice breaking, "Then show me how." The fox mother pressed the cub closer, her body trembling but unbroken. In that moment, survival was no longer a question. It was a war written in ice and blood. The storm thinned just enough to reveal the desperate figures within. Edward gasped, "We are alive, but not safe." His eyes flickered to Margaret, whose trembling hands clutched his arm. The fox mother crouched, her body shielding the cub, her amber eyes bright with fear. The wolf lingered, its shadow circling at the edge of sight. Margaret whispered, "They will not survive this cold." Edward stared at the fragile cub, its breath shallow, barely stirring the snow. For a fleeting moment, the storm's roar softened, replaced by the tiny whimper of life. The cold gnawed deeper, but empathy burned hotter, pulling Edward forward. He said, "We keep moving for them as much as us." In that moment, the fight was no longer only survival. It was for something fragile, something innocent, something worth saving. The trees parted, revealing a clearing buried under white silence. Edward staggered, then steadied himself, his breath ragged. Margaret said, "I can't feel my hands." She pressed them against her chest, eyes glazed. The fox mother dragged her cub slowly, each step carving fragile trails. Edward bent low, his voice steady but fierce. "Don't let the storm take you." His words carried more to Margaret than himself. The wolf's outline flashed again, closer, watching. Edward growled back into the wind, "You will not take them." The air trembled, carrying both defiance and fear. Margaret looked to Edward, her lips quivering. "Why fight? We are broken already." Edward pulled her against him, his face hollow yet burning. "Because they need us." In the frozen wasteland, the bond between fragile lives became the only anchor left. The storm's howl faded into a suffocating quiet, every sound smothered in snow. Edward whispered, "Listen." Margaret froze, her wide eyes searching, heart hammering. The fox cub whimpered, small voice carrying more weight than thunder. The wolf exhaled, a low growl rolling through the clearing like stones sliding on stone. Edward's jaw tightened, his hand gripping Margaret's shoulder. "Stay close," he said, his voice steady but lined with dread. Margaret's breath came shallow, frost dancing with every exhale. She said, "It waits for us to fall." The silence pressed harder, every heartbeat too loud, too fragile. Edward glanced at the cub again, the flicker of innocent sparking rage within him. "Not tonight," he growled. The storm might break them, but hope, no matter how faint, still clung like fire in the dark. The storm returned in sudden gusts, tearing at their coats and faces. Edward pulled Margaret forward, his voice breaking, "Move, before it takes us." The fox mother limped, her cub clinging desperately beneath her belly. Snow blurred their path, a white wall swallowing ground and sky. Margaret stumbled, falling hard. Edward lifted her, his arms trembling, veins of exhaustion running deep. "I cannot," she whispered, her eyes dull with surrender. Edward shook her, teeth clenched. "You must." Behind them, the wolf's howl cracked the storm's rhythm, chilling bone deeper than the wind. Edward's chest burned as if fire lived inside frozen lungs. His rage was not at the storm, but at the silence that came if they failed. He said, "We carry them or we are nothing." The storm agreed, striking harder. The clearing ended at a frozen stream, ice cracked and groaning under weight. Edward stopped, pulling Margaret against his side. "Careful," he warned. Margaret's lips parted. "If it breaks, we die here." The fox mother sniffed the surface, her cub whining softly. Edward stepped forward, each crunch echoing like glass underfoot. His breath clouded around him, sharp and fleeting. The wolf appeared at the treeline, eyes burning like coals. Margaret gasped, clinging tighter. "It waits." Edward said, "No. It watches." His voice carried iron, though his knees shook with weakness. The storm dimmed, leaving silence pierced only by the cub's faint cry. Edward stared ahead, seeing not just the stream, but the fragile chain tying them all together. In that instant, he vowed their survival meant more than his own. The frozen stream groaned beneath their boots, each step threatening collapse into black water below. Edward whispered, "Don't look down." His words carried iron, though fear cracked his tone. Margaret clutched his coat, her hands trembling like fragile branches. The fox mother moved cautiously, her body pressed low, the cub clinging beneath her belly. its tiny cries almost erased by the wind. A sharp crack split the silence, racing across the ice like a bolt of lightning. Margaret gasped, "It will break." Edward's jaw tightened as he pulled her forward, every tendon straining. Behind them, the wolf's shadow prowled along the tree line, its glowing eyes patient and merciless. The storm lashed harder, snow swirling in blinding chaos, erasing the horizon. Edward's rage grew hotter than fear. "Faster," he growled. Each step felt like betrayal, but stopping meant death. The storm howled, burying the clearing in white chaos. Edward shouted, "We are almost across." His voice cracked like brittle wood. Margaret stumbled, her legs weak, body collapsing into the snow. Edward hauled her up, muscles screaming against exhaustion, his breath ragged. The fox mother yelped, her paws slipping as the cub clung tighter to her belly fur. The wolf circled, its shadow moving closer, always patient, always silent. Margaret whispered, "It's hunting us." Edward's teeth bared as his jaw locked. "Then let it try." I was so. Beneath them, ice splintered, water churning below like a monster ready to swallow. Fear gnawed like frost in bone, but Edward's fury kept him upright. He dragged Margaret forward, each step defiance. The storm pressed with claws of wind, and the wolf pressed with eyes of fire. Both demanded surrender, but he gave neither. The storm twisted louder, erasing sky and ground until only white blindness remained. Edward bent forward, his breath ragged, his body bent but unbroken. Margaret clung to him, her lips trembling, eyes wide with despair. The fox cub whimpered again, its frail voice slicing sharper than the storm's roar. Edward glared into the storm, catching the wolf's eyes glowing like embers. Rage lit his chest like fire. "You want us weak," he snarled, "but you will never have us broken." Margaret whispered, "We cannot outrun it." Edward's grip tightened, his voice steel against fear. "Then we fight." The wolf stepped forward, its muscles rippling under thick fur, steam rising from its breath, glowing eyes locked. The storm bent trees until they cracked, snow falling like spears. Margaret gasped, her body trembling, her heart pounding loud enough to be heard. The clearing shattered into chaos as wind lashed like whips, tearing visibility into nothing. Edward shoved forward, shouting, "Move!" His voice was swallowed instantly. Margaret fell hard, her knees tearing against ice, blood streaking the white. Edward yanked her back, veins burning, his jaw iron. The fox mother snarled, fur bristled, her cub pressed tight beneath, tiny whines trembling through storm. The wolf crept closer, muscles rippling, glowing eyes cutting through haze. Margaret whispered, "It waits for the moment we fall." Edward spat blood into snow, his face grim. "Then we give it nothing." The ground split open behind them, ice cracking with violent force, water churning like jaws waiting below. The wolf's growl rumbled, low and merciless. The storm howled in approval, shaking the forest to its roots. Edward's arm tightened around Margaret. "Not while I breathe." The storm raged to its height, a wall of fury crushing air and hope. Edward swayed on unsteady legs, frost etched deep in his face, but his eyes still burned. Margaret sobbed, her voice breaking. "I cannot go on." Edward roared back, "You will, because we must." His voice carved through the storm like iron against stone. The fox cub whimpered louder, its cry fragile yet piercing, louder than thunder. The wolf stepped into view fully now, muscles coiled, its breath steaming like smoke, its glowing eyes locked. Edward clenched his fists, blood dripping from cracked knuckles, chest heaving. "This is where we stand," he said. Margaret's tears froze mid-fall, streaks of ice marking despair. The fox mother growled low, her stance unyielding. Snow hammered them like nails, trees groaning, world collapsing. Edward growled once more, "We are not done yet." The storm eased for a heartbeat, silence pressing heavier than the roar. Edward whispered, "It's watching." his eyes fixed on the wolf, no longer just predator, but something deeper. Margaret shivered, her voice fragile. It waits like we do. The fox mother stood rigid, her amber eyes glowing against snow. The cub pressed under her. The wolf stepped closer, not with hunger but hesitation, muscles tight yet eyes carrying something unfamiliar. Edward's chest rose sharply, his voice lower. "It's not killing us. Not yet." Margaret's breath trembled, frost freezing at her lips. "Why?" The wolf growled, but the sound lacked the killing strike. The storm screamed around them, yet within the clearing, time slowed, exposing a truth neither expected. Predator and prey trapped under the same merciless sky, both struggling for survival against something greater than hunger. Edward's breath clouded, his gaze locked on the wolf's steady eyes. Margaret whispered, "It is no hunter. It is desperate." The storm clawed at the clearing, trees snapping in distance. The wolf exhaled hard, steam pluming like smoke, its ribs showing beneath thick fur. Edward saw weakness, hunger not driven by choice but by survival. He said, "It starves as we do." Margaret clutched his arm tighter, her voice breaking. "We are the same." The fox cub whimpered softly, and the wolf flinched at the sound, its ears twitching. The predator was not merciless shadow, but fragile endurance, carved by the same storm. Edward muttered, "It is not only us the snow once buried." The revelation cracked something within him, fear folding into grim kinship, a bond forged not by choice, but by shared doom. The storm surged again, snow falling like blades. But Edward no longer saw only threat. He whispered, "We are not its prey. We are its mirror." Margaret's lips quivered, her face pale as she muttered, "But the storm, it spares no one." The wolf lowered its head slightly, body rigid, eyes fixed not on Edward but on the cub. Its growl softened, almost mournful. Edward's chest tightened, rage shifting to something rawer, pity. He said, "It fights to live, as we do." The fox mother bristled, her growl defiant, but even she wavered at the wolf's hesitation. The storm cracked branches above, ice falling like shrapnel around them. Edward reached for Margaret, pulling her close, his voice low, "We fight nature, not each other." The wolf's silence answered louder than any howl. It too was prey tonight. The storm ripped harder, snow twisting into walls, erasing paths in every direction. Edward clenched his fists, voice hoarse. "It is not the wolf. It is the cold." Margaret staggered, her eyes glassy. "The snow is the killer." The wolf prowled closer, its breath steaming, yet its eyes avoided them, watching the sky, the storm, the trees. The fox cub squeaked, tiny voice slicing through the roar. The wolf's ears flicked, body rigid, not an attack but recognition. Edward muttered, "It knows loss." Margaret pressed against him, trembling. The truth was undeniable. Their enemy was not a creature of fur and fang, but the merciless blizzard itself. For the first time, predator and prey stood bound by one fate. Edward said, "It will bury us all." His voice carried not fear, but surrender to truth carved in frost. The forest groaned, trees snapping like bones as snow crushed the ground. Edward shouted over the roar, "The storm hunts everything." His words were swallowed, but burned in Margaret's chest. The wolf's growl rose again, but this time it was not hunger, it was defiance. Edward stepped forward, eyes blazing. "We share its enemy." Margaret gasped. "Then we are not alone." The fox mother shifted, curling tighter around her cub, her body trembling but unbroken. The wolf stood, chest heaving, eyes fixed on the storm's chaos. Predator and prey became something else, survivors chained by the same doom. Edward's voice cut through the blizzard, ragged but unyielding. "We endure, or we fall together." The storm answered with fury, flinging snow in walls. But inside the circle of frost, truth bound them all as equals. The storm struck with fury, tearing branches like paper, snow falling in violent waves. Edward roared, "Stand firm!" His fists clenched, blood dripping from cracked skin. Margaret cried out, her voice breaking. "It will kill us." Her scarf whipped violently, her face streaked with frozen tears. The fox cub squealed, its body pressed against the fox mother's chest, her fur-bristled eyes burning with defiance. The wolf stepped closer, muscles coiled, not as hunter but as challenger to the storm. Edward's breath steamed like smoke as he shouted, "We fight now!" The wind screamed louder, drowning everything, flinging shards of ice like blades. The forest quaked, trees collapsing under the weight. Survival was no longer hiding, but clashing head-on with the fury of nature itself. Snow hammered down, burying their tracks, turning ground into shifting death. Edward stumbled, his chest heaving, but rose again with a snarl. "We do not fall here," he roared, his voice tearing through the gale. Margaret grasped his arm, her face pale. "Edward, I can't." The fox mother snarled, her cubs squeaking beneath her trembling body. The wolf paced, circling, growled deep, but not aimed at them, aimed at the storm. Edward spat blood, his lips blue. "If we die fighting." Lightning split the sky, illuminating the figures trapped in the blizzard. The storm pressed harder, wind clawing like talons, ice cracking beneath their feet. Every heartbeat was war, every breath survival against the crushing force of winter's wrath. The wind shrieked like 1,000 knives, slicing skin raw. "Ha!" Edward pressed forward, dragging Margaret, his eyes burning with rage. Margaret sobbed, "It is too much." Her body swayed, on the edge of collapse. Edward shouted back, "We are still breathing. That is enough." The fox cub cried louder, its frail voice piercing the storm's roar, pulling Edward's will into steel. The fox mother planted her paws firm, her body a trembling wall of defiance. The wolf leapt forward suddenly, not toward them but past them, tearing at falling branches, scattering snow. Edward's eyes widened, the truth undeniable. Predator and prey both struck by the same storm, forced into the same desperate fight. The ground trembled as more trees split, snow collapsing like walls. Edward roared louder than wind, "Survive!" The storm roared, collapsing the forest around them, each crash echoing like thunder. Edward hauled Margaret upright, his voice ragged, "Do not stop." Her eyes were glazed, lips cracked. "I can't see." The fox cub whimpered, its small body barely visible beneath the mother's trembling fur. The wolf howled, not to hunt, but to defy the storm, its cry ripping through the blizzard like fire. Edward's fists clenched, his body swaying, every vein burning with exhaustion. He shouted, "We fight together!" The storm struck harder, snow flying in walls, shards biting skin. Margaret clung tighter, tears freezing instantly. Edward's jaw trembled, but his eyes stayed fierce. The wolf's growl joined the wind, not as threat but as ally. An anthem of survival shared by all beneath the storm. The storm's peak crashed upon them, the world reduced to white chaos. Edward stood tall, fists bloodied, his face frozen but unyielding. Margaret sobbed, clinging to him with all that remained. The fox cub whimpered, its cry desperate but alive, as the fox mother pressed closer, her body quaking. The wolf advanced, its eyes glowing like embers in the storm, no longer predator but companion in defiance. Edward roared, his voice shattered but fierce, "We do not die here." Lightning split again, igniting the clearing, casting shadows of survivors against the snow. The storm flung its fury, shaking earth, tearing sky, but inside, the chaos, life, stood firm, trembling but unbroken. Every heartbeat was a war cry, every breath a strike against extinction. Nature demanded surrender. Edward answered, "Not yet." The storm broke with a sudden silence, as if the world itself paused to breathe. Edward staggered, his body shaking, blood frozen on his knuckles. Margaret leaned against him, her face pale, tears crystallized into icy streaks. The fox cub whimpered faintly, a fragile reminder of life clinging to the edge. The fox mother's eyes glowed faint with exhaustion, her fur crusted with frost, but she still stood protectively. The wolf lowered its head, its breath steaming in slow bursts, its chest heaving. Edward whispered, "It is over." But the silence felt heavier than the roar, filled with the weight of what was lost and what remained. Margaret's lips quivered as she murmured, "We are not the same anymore." The storm had passed, yet it left behind a scar cut into bone and memory. The forest lay broken, trees splintered like bones, the snow deep and unforgiving. Edward lifted Margaret gently, his arms heavy but steady. She whispered, "I cannot walk." He pressed her closer, murmuring, "Then I carry you." The fox mother limped, her paw dragging, yet her cub clung tight to her chest. The wolf walked a short distance behind, its head bowed, eyes watching but no longer filled with threat. The air was still, the silence suffocating. Edward's breath misted slowly, his face hardened with weary resolve. "We survived," he muttered, though the words tasted like ash. Margaret's eyes fluttered shut, exhaustion dragging her toward darkness. Thorn had spared them, but only by grinding them into ghosts of what they once were. Survival was theirs, but at a cost carved deep. The clearing stretched before them, painted in the pale light of dawn breaking through clouds. Edward collapsed to his knees, Margaret still in his arms, his chest heaving. She whispered, "Is this the end?" Her voice cracked like brittle glass. Edward kissed her forehead, frost clinging to his beard. "No, it is only what remains." The fox cub crawled out from beneath its mother, squeaking weakly, a sound that felt louder than thunder in the silence. The wolf lowered itself onto the snow, lying still but watching with steady eyes. Edward looked at it and whispered, "We live because we refuse to fall." Margaret closed her eyes, breathing faint but steady. The dawn was no victory, but a fragile reminder that even shattered, life had endured. The forest whispered with silence, branches bent but no longer breaking. Edward forced himself upright, Margaret leaning against him, her breath shallow but real. The fox mother curled around her cub, trembling, yet her eyes burned with protective fire. The wolf stood again, lifting its head toward the dawn, its breath steaming in long trails. Edward whispered, "The storm has taken everything, but it did not take us." Margaret's lips curved faintly, her eyes heavy. "We are scarred, but we are still here." The silence was not peace, but the crushing weight of inevitability. The storm had not chosen mercy, only balance, sparing just enough to remind them survival was not victory, but burden. Edward pressed Margaret close, his eyes reflecting both grief and defiance. The dawn stretched across the snow, pale gold searing through the ruin of the storm. Edward stood at the edge of the clearing, Margaret leaning on him, both broken but upright. The fox cub whimpered, its tiny body pressing against its mother, alive despite the storm's hunger. The wolf lingered in the shadows of the tree line, its glowing eyes softer now, its body weary but unbowed. Edward whispered, "Nature takes, but it also leaves behind." Margaret's hand trembled against his, her voice weak but steady. "We endured." The silence stretched, heavy, eternal. The storm was gone, but its echo remained in every breath. Edward's eyes narrowed as he stared into the horizon. Survival was not triumph. It was the cruel, beautiful weight of still breathing when everything else had fallen. Dawn stretched weakly across the snow, painting gold over ruin. Edward stood unmoving, Margaret leaning against him, her breaths shallow but steady. The fox mother curled around her cub, both trembling yet alive. The wolf lingered at the tree line, its glowing eyes softer now, no longer predator but survivor. Edward whispered, "The storm is gone, but it will return again." Margaret's lips trembled, her words broken. "Then so must we." Silence fell heavy, thicker than the storm itself, a silence carved by loss and fragile endurance. The snow lay deep, hiding scars beneath its surface, but the truth remained. Survival had demanded everything. And yet, breath still fogged the air, defying extinction. The wind calmed into whispers, brushing frost from broken branches. Edward looked down at Margaret, his voice raw. "You are still breathing. That is enough." She closed her eyes, her lips curling faintly, for now. The fox cub whimpered, a weak cry that pierced the silence. The fox mother pressed her head close to him, her breath visible in steady rhythm. The wolf sat in the distance, its ribs rising and falling, its gaze fixed on the survivors with strange kinship. Edward exhaled, steam drifting upward like prayer. "This is what remains of us." The storm had not chosen mercy, but the dawn had allowed them to stand. The echo of death lingered, but so did the fragile defiance of life. The forest lay shattered, trees broken, snow piled in jagged towers. Edward whispered, "This is the price of survival." Margaret's hand slid into his, trembling but present. The fox cub peeked weakly from its mother's fur, eyes wide, reflecting faint light of morning. The wolf rose again, its body weary but upright, steam curling from its breath. Edward's eyes narrowed, his voice firm. "We carry the scars, but we endure." Margaret opened her eyes, whispering, "Endurance is not victory." Her words carried truth. Survival was only the shadow of triumph, not its light. Still, the cub's cry, the wolf's stance, and Edward's breath all proved that life resisted silence. Nature had struck, but it had not erased. The echo of defiance remained. The snow glittered in pale gold, hiding death beneath its shine. Edward lifted Margaret gently, his body trembling but refusing collapse. She whispered faintly, "The storm took everything." He pressed her closer, murmuring, "It did not take us." The fox cub squeaked again, fragile yet persistent, its sound cutting the silence like a knife. The fox mother raised her head, ears twitching, eyes weary but bright. The wolf watched, its gaze unflinching, its body framed by broken trees. Edward looked at it, his voice low, "We are bound by survival." For one breath, predator, prey, and man shared the same truth. Endurance was all that mattered. The storm was gone, but its echo lingered in every breath, every wound, every trembling heartbeat refusing to stop. The forest fell still, silence heavier than storm. Edward stood at the edge of ruin, Margaret in his arms, her breath faint but present. The fox cub curled against its mother, their bodies trembling yet unbroken. The wolf lingered at the edge, its eyes glowing in dawn, eternal witness to survival's cost. Edward whispered, "The storm will return. But so will we." Margaret's lips quivered, a faint whisper, "We are the echo." The last sound was not the roar of wind, but the fragile cry of the cub, life clawing against silence. The storm had passed, but its shadow stretched forever, binding survivors in its memory. Nature had demanded sacrifice. What remained was the echo, fragile, haunting, eternal.